My name is Emily Grant, and for most of my life, I thought I understood strength. I believed it came through loud voices, firm handshakes, and commanding presence. At least that's how I had always been taught. But my understanding of strength began to unravel the day my son, Noah, entered middle school. Noah was 12 then, with soft eyes and an even softer voice, and a quiet way of slipping into rooms like a whisper. He wasn't shy exactly. At least not in the way people often misunderstand shyness. He simply preferred observation over participation, choosing to speak when he had something meaningful to say. But in a world that often values volume over value, that choice made him a target. It started subtly. Comments from teachers about participation. Remarks from family friends. "He's so quiet. Are you sure everything's okay?" At first, I dismissed it. Noah was happy at home, a voracious reader, endlessly curious, and always asking thoughtful questions when we talked alone. But as the school years progressed, those small remarks snowballed into something heavier. One afternoon, I received an email from his English teacher, Mrs. Riley. She praised his essays but expressed concern over his lack of verbal contributions in class. "Noah is intelligent," she wrote, "but if he doesn't learn to speak up, he'll be overlooked." Overlooked. That word stuck with me. I couldn't shake the worry that she was right, not because Noah lacked brilliance, but because others couldn't see it through the lens of his silence. I tried encouraging him, gently nudging him to join clubs, raise his hand more, practice speaking up. But Noah would just smile politely and retreat into his room with a book, leaving me standing in the hallway, wondering if I was helping or hurting. Things reached a boiling point in 8th grade, when the school held its annual group presentations. Students were assigned random teams and given a week to prepare. Noah came home with tension in his shoulders, the quiet sort of dread he never voiced aloud. He had been paired with 3 of the most dominant students in his class, kids who were known for taking control, often steamrolling over others to shine. On presentation day, I received a phone call from the assistant principal. There had been an incident, she said. Apparently, during the presentation, Noah had been given the role of clicking the slides, nothing more. When the teacher asked why he hadn't spoken during the actual content delivery, one of the group members shrugged and said, "He's too quiet to explain anything." The room laughed. My son didn't. When I picked him up that afternoon, Noah didn't speak until we were halfway home. "I didn't mind not talking," he said quietly, "but it was the way they looked at me, like I wasn't even smart enough to be part of it." I gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. That night, I cried in the shower, not just out of anger for how he'd been treated, but because I realized how powerless I felt to protect him from a world that saw his quietness as a flaw. Over the next few months, things only got worse. The kids at school began to call him Mute Noah or Silent Sam, even though his name wasn't Sam. It was meant as a joke, of course. But those jokes wear a person down. Noah never said anything directly, but I could see it in his posture, in the way he began to avoid eye contact, even with me. He stopped asking questions at the dinner table. His appetite faded. He still did well in school. Perfect grades, always, but the spark was dimming. And I, as his mother, didn't know how to reignite it. One afternoon, I sat across from the school counselor, trying to explain what was happening without sounding like an overprotective parent. "He's not being bullied in the traditional sense," I said, "but he's being erased, little by little." The counselor nodded sympathetically, but her advice was practical, not emotional. "He needs to find his voice," she said. "Maybe he should join something that forces him to speak, like debate club." I almost laughed. My son? In debate? The very thought was absurd. But when I brought it up to Noah later that night, expecting a firm no, he surprised me. He tilted his head slightly, considering it. "Maybe," he said. "If it's not too loud." The following week, he attended his first debate club meeting. I waited in the car, expecting him to walk out after 5 minutes, overwhelmed and frustrated. Instead, he stayed the full hour. When he returned, he slid into the passenger seat and buckled in, his face unreadable. "How was it?" I asked. "It was interesting," he replied. That was all he said. But the next week, he went again. And then again. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't dramatic. But something in him began to shift. He would talk about argument structures during dinner, discuss logical fallacies like they were plot points in a novel. He didn't volunteer for competitions yet, just sat in the back, soaking it in. But I saw the light returning. His shoulders relaxed. His eyes were clearer. Still, not everyone understood. At a parent-teacher night, I overheard a mother saying, "Debate? Noah? Isn't he the one who never speaks?" The implication was clear. He didn't belong there. But I was beginning to believe that was exactly where he did belong. The true turning point hadn't arrived yet. There were still months to go, and many challenges ahead. But the seed had been planted. For the first time, Noah had chosen something not in spite of his quietness, but because of it. He didn't need to be loud. He just needed a place where his voice, however soft, was heard. And that, more than anything, was the beginning of everything. The weeks following Noah's quiet commitment to debate club felt like watching a delicate bud begin to open in slow motion. He didn't come home with stories of grand victories or boastful claims. Noah wasn't built that way, but there was a new steadiness in him, a subtle sense of purpose. He'd still walk into a room gently, still spoke softly, but now he carried a folder filled with scribbled notes and highlighted debate formats. I knew better than to crowd him with questions, but I'd catch glimpses. His laptop open to YouTube debates, post-it notes lining his desk like miniature soldiers, his lips sometimes moving silently as he rehearsed points in front of the mirror. My son was preparing for something, even if neither of us quite knew what. At school, the shift didn't go unnoticed. The same classmates who had laughed when he was sidelined during the presentation began to glance at him with faint curiosity. The whispers still lingered, of course. Kids calling him the monk or the statue because of his silence, but the tone had changed. There was less mockery and more confusion. They didn't understand why someone like Noah, the boy who once chose being invisible over being mocked, would willingly step into a club where speaking was the entire point. His English teacher, Mrs. Riley, reached out again. This time her tone had softened. She mentioned Noah had asked to stay after class to review persuasive techniques and that he'd submitted a mock speech that was so precise and thoughtful, it made her tear up. I sat with that email for a while, rereading it until the words began to blur. My son wasn't just trying. He was learning to take space without changing who he was. Still, the obstacles didn't vanish. In fact, the deeper he stepped into the world of debate, the more obvious the gap became. The other students were louder, quicker with comebacks, more comfortable thinking on their feet. During mock sessions, Noah struggled to keep up with their pace, not because he lacked the intellect, but because his mind liked to consider every angle before landing on a point. His debate coach, Mr. Peterson, pulled me aside after one of the school's open sessions. He was kind but blunt. "Noah's incredibly bright," he said. "But debate's a game of speed. I worry the format may not suit his temperament." I could see it too. Noah would stand there, notes in hand, his mouth opening a half-second too late. By the time he delivered a line, his opponent had already pivoted to a new point. His arguments were brilliant, but they weren't fast. The club's upcoming regional qualifiers loomed on the calendar, and I wasn't sure whether Noah would even qualify, let alone compete. At home, I found him pacing his room late at night, whispering arguments to himself. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from frustration. He didn't tell me directly, but I knew. He was trying to train his mind to move faster, to work against its natural rhythm. And though I admired his determination, it broke my heart a little. My son had always thrived in spaces where silence gave room to think. Now, the very essence of who he was felt like a disadvantage. One Friday evening, just 2 weeks before the qualifiers, I came home to find Noah sitting alone on the porch steps, knees tucked under his chin. His debate binder lay beside him, closed. I sat down next to him without a word. The spring air was warm, but he looked cold, distant, as if the world had shifted just slightly out of reach. "They laughed again today," he said, not looking at me. "During practice." When I paused too long, someone said, "Well, there goes our shot at regionals." His voice cracked, just slightly. "I don't think I belong there, Mom." I took a breath, choosing my words slowly, carefully. "Noah, being different doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you have something they don't." He didn't respond right away. A breeze moved through the trees, filling the space where words hadn't yet landed. "You don't have to outshout them. You just have to outthink them. And you already do." He was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "But what if no one sees it?" That question stayed with me. It haunted me in ways I hadn't expected, because it wasn't just about debate. It was about life. About how many quiet, brilliant people are passed over because the world is too loud to hear them. And I realized then that my job wasn't to teach Noah to be louder. It was to help the world listen better. Over the next few days, I watched Noah shift strategies. He stopped trying to mimic the fast-talking debaters. Instead, he began crafting tighter arguments, short, direct, piercing. He simplified his points without watering them down. It was a subtle rebellion, really. He wasn't changing himself, he was changing the game. When the qualifiers finally arrived, I drove him to the high school auditorium just after dawn. His face was calm, unreadable. "I don't know what's going to happen," he said as we pulled into the parking lot. "But I'm going to say what I came to say." I squeezed his hand. "Then that's already a win." What neither of us knew then was how that morning would mark the beginning of something far greater than a competition. Noah wasn't just walking into a debate round. He was stepping into the center of the storm, the place where judgment, pressure, and doubt collided. And for the first time, he wasn't running from it. He was ready to speak. The high school auditorium was colder than I remembered from previous events. Rows of foldable chairs stretched before a modest stage, flanked by banners reading regional debate qualifiers, "Speak to be heard." Parents, coaches, and a sea of students bustled around in clusters, their energy bouncing off the walls. But Noah stood alone near the edge of the stage area, his fingers calmly flipping through a few last-minute notes. His posture wasn't slouched in fear, but steady, like a quiet flame refusing to flicker even in a gust. Each round of the competition was set up in different classrooms, transformed temporarily into miniature debating arenas. I wasn't allowed to be in the room while he competed, and that separation felt like 1,000 walls between us. All I could do was wait in the general holding area with other parents, most of whom chatted easily about their children's natural gift for speaking. I nodded politely, keeping my thoughts tucked inward like Noah did. He didn't need me cheering in a crowd. He needed me to believe in silence, in stillness, just as fiercely as I believed in his words. The first round came and went. Then the second. I checked my phone obsessively, waiting for updates. Hours passed like days. Then finally, Noah stepped into the waiting area again. His face was unreadable, and for a moment, my heart sank. Had it been too much? Had he struggled to keep up? But as he walked toward me, something caught my eye, a faint curl at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile exactly, but something close, like he'd been holding in something warm and didn't quite know how to let it out. "I made it to the semis," he said simply, sitting beside me and placing his debate binder on the table. I blinked at him, stunned, and then quickly collected myself. "That's incredible," I said, my voice lower than the enthusiasm I felt, mirroring his calm energy. "How do you feel?" He paused. Focused. Not relieved. Just ready for more. I wanted to hug him, to shout my pride to the room, but I held back. Instead, I reached out and gently tapped his knuckles. He nodded, and we sat in quiet agreement that something significant had just begun. The semi-final round would be the next day. Noah would face off against students from private academies, some of whom had professional coaching and years of experience. I worried about the dynamics, whether his soft-spoken delivery would hold its own against polished voices trained to dominate. But that night, as I watched him prepare, I noticed he wasn't studying his opponents. He was studying ideas. Ethics, climate policy, economic equity. He immersed himself in facts and logic, crafting not only what he would say, but why he believed in each argument. This wasn't a performance to him. It was a truth he wanted the world to hear. The next morning, the air felt thick with anticipation. I dropped him off at the venue early. He didn't need me to walk him in. He just turned to me before getting out of the car and said, "I don't want to win because they pity me. I want to win because I deserve it." That sentence hit me like thunder. He wasn't afraid of the spotlight anymore. He was demanding a place in it. Hours later, I sat outside the final round room, my heart doing acrobatics. I could hear faint echoes, nothing clear, but the rhythm of voices told me when Noah was speaking. His cadence was slower than the others, but not hesitant. It was the kind of pace that forced you to lean in to listen. I saw a couple of parents walk past, whispering about the quiet one, with curious looks on their faces. One even said, "He's not what I expected. But there's something commanding about him." When the door finally opened and the round ended, Noah walked out, eyes straight ahead. He didn't look for validation. He didn't search the crowd. He walked like someone who had spoken his piece and left it all behind him. I knew better than to ask how it went. Instead, we drove home in near silence, his bag tucked in the back seat, his hands resting quietly in his lap. Later that evening, a message came through from the debate coordinator. Finalists will be announced in the morning. Thank you to all participants for an exceptional showing. My chest tightened. Noah read the email over my shoulder, and I turned to ask how he felt. But he had already returned to his desk, casually flipping through a new book on ancient rhetoric. He didn't need the result to define him. But still, I knew it mattered. The next morning, the announcement came via email at exactly 8 a.m. The top 8 students from the regional qualifier were listed. I scrolled quickly, barely breathing. There. At number 3. Noah Bennett. Westfield High School. I stared at it for a full 10 seconds before calling his name. When he came over, I simply pointed at the screen. He leaned in slowly, read the line, and blinked. I made nationals, he whispered, as if the idea hadn't fully formed in his mind until that moment. And then, just then, he smiled. Fully. Proudly. It wasn't a loud celebration. There were no shouts, no trophies lifted high. Just a boy who once sat alone during recess, now standing at the edge of a new chapter, because he had found the courage to speak in a world that never taught him how. The morning of the national championship arrived with a stillness that felt sacred. Noah stood by the window of our hotel room, watching the gray sky stretch out above the skyline of Washington, D.C., his hands clasped behind his back. He hadn't touched his breakfast, but there was no sign of anxiety in him. Only quiet focus, the kind that comes from knowing you've walked through fire and now stand on the edge of something irreversible. He was about to face the final round of the most prestigious high school debate competition in the country, and he wasn't shaking. He was ready. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching him like a mother might watch her child before the first day of school, only this felt bigger, more defining. Not because of the trophy, but because this was the moment everything he'd endured, from being mocked by classmates to being overlooked by teachers, would either be dismissed as coincidence or cemented as proof. This was about rewriting the story that had been forced onto him, sentence by sentence, for years. We walked to the venue in silence, passing students in perfectly pressed suits, parents with clipboards and cameras, coaches whispering last-minute advice. When we entered the final debate hall, I felt an immediate change in atmosphere. The auditorium wasn't large, but the air was thick with anticipation. The judges sat elevated behind a long table, papers already in place, names already known. There were rows of seats filled with families, peers, and faculty. Everyone here was somebody. Everyone had earned this moment. Noah's opponent was a boy named Chase from an elite private academy in New York. Everything about him screamed polish and privilege. His suit immaculate, his posture unbreakable, his smirk lingering just long enough to make you second-guess your own worth. He was a seasoned debater, someone who had probably been groomed for stages like this since middle school. But when he glanced over at Noah, I noticed something that gave me pause. Hesitation. Maybe Chase had read the same article in the newspaper. Maybe he'd seen the quote about silence not being weakness. Or maybe he'd simply sensed that Noah was not what he appeared to be. The topic for the final round was announced. Is technology harming interpersonal communication more than it is helping it? A wide topic, open to interpretation, rich with opportunity. Noah drew the position of affirmative, arguing that it does more harm. A subtle nod to irony, I thought, considering how many times he had been dismissed for not speaking enough. Now he would argue the value of human connection, of voice, of presence. Chase opened strong, as expected. His words were sharp, his delivery fluid, laced with statistics and rhetorical flourishes that showed he knew how to own a room. The audience clapped politely, impressed. When it was Noah's turn, I could hear my own heartbeat louder than the applause. He stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and paused, not out of fear, but out of control. He let the silence stretch, letting every eye in the room fall fully onto him. And then he began. Technology, he said slowly, has given us the power to speak at any time, and yet we listen less than ever. The first sentence landed like a pin drop in a cathedral. Heads tilted. Pens paused. And then he continued. Not fast, not flashy, but deliberate. He didn't bombard the judges with statistics. Instead, he told a story. Not his own, but one we all recognized. Of families at dinner tables where everyone was scrolling. Of students in classrooms more connected to their phones than to each other. Of conversations that had turned into comment sections, and friendships reduced to likes. And woven into all of it was the unspoken truth. He was speaking about himself, without ever saying so directly. He drew parallels between silence chosen and silence forced. He made them understand that just because someone isn't loud doesn't mean they're disconnected. And just because we can reach people faster doesn't mean we reach them deeper. His words weren't just logical, they were lived. And it showed. During his rebuttals, Noah remained poised. Chase tried to rattle him, using sarcasm and speed to throw him off balance, but Noah never flinched. He absorbed each jab like it was wind hitting stone. He didn't block, he endured. And when it was time for his final speech, he didn't try to outtalk his opponent. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, and then looked straight at the judges. I used to think not being loud meant I didn't belong in conversations, he said. But I've learned something. The loudest voice isn't always the clearest one. And real communication starts when we stop shouting and start listening. There it was. The moment. No dramatic mic drop. No theatrics. Just truth, offered plainly. The silence that followed his final words wasn't empty. It was full. Full of recognition, full of impact. The judges looked at one another, quietly scribbling. The audience held still for a few seconds longer than usual before clapping, and then the applause broke out. Not polite this time, but genuine. Sustained. After the round, I met Noah backstage. He didn't ask how he did. He didn't boast or worry. He just smiled, small, soft but real. I hugged him tightly and whispered, "No matter what happens next, you did something no one can ever take away." And I meant it. Because even if he didn't win, and we still didn't know if he would, he had already won something far greater. He had stood tall in a place built for voices and proved that his mattered. Not in volume, but in value. We waited for the results, sitting side by side in the audience. Noah's hands rested calmly on his lap. Chase sat 3 rows ahead, still posturing. Then the announcer took the stage with an envelope in hand. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might echo in the auditorium. And this year's national debate champion is Noah Callahan. For a second, it didn't register. There was a beat of stunned silence, like the entire room was collectively verifying what they just heard. Then, the auditorium erupted. I felt a jolt of breath leave my chest as people around us clapped, some even standing. My eyes filled with tears, and I turned to see Noah still sitting. Frozen, mouth slightly open. For someone who had never craved the spotlight, the light now shining on him seemed almost too surreal to accept. He blinked slowly, then rose to his feet with a grace that defied the chaos unfolding around him. The announcer motioned him toward the stage. Noah walked steadily, not in triumph, but with quiet reverence, like someone approaching the culmination of a deeply personal pilgrimage. The judges rose to greet him. One of them, a gray-haired woman with a reputation for being fiercely critical, shook his hand firmly and said something I couldn't hear. But Noah nodded in response, and his expression softened. Whatever she said, it had landed somewhere deep. As he took the trophy into his hands, a flashbulb of memory hit me. Of Noah at 8 years old, curled on his bed, asking why the other kids thought he was weird. Of the first time he came home from school silent for days after a group of classmates had laughed at him during a presentation. Those wounds didn't just disappear. They stayed with him, stitched into his identity. But now, standing there beneath the bright stage lights, he wasn't a boy burdened by past shame. He was the embodiment of resilience. After the ceremony, people came up to him, students, parents, even other competitors, congratulating him, asking questions, shaking his hand. Chase stood nearby, nodding politely, though the gleam in his eyes was visibly dimmed. It wasn't just defeat he was feeling. It was disorientation. He had come expecting to win through force and flair. But he'd been bested by someone who spoke from stillness and purpose. That kind of loss stays with you. Backstage, Noah let out a breath and turned to me with a half-laugh, the weight of the day finally catching up to him. "I think my legs forgot how to work," he said. His voice warm and light in a way I hadn't heard in a long time. I hugged him tightly, this time with the full realization that something had shifted forever. Not just for him, but for how the world would now see him. We spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze, walking through the capital, trophy tucked under his arm, occasionally pausing when someone recognized him from the event. One older man, an English teacher from a small town in Ohio, stopped us near the Lincoln Memorial. He introduced himself and told Noah, "You reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. Thank you for that." Noah smiled humbly and said, "Thank you for listening." Later that evening, we sat together in the quiet of our hotel room. Noah placed the trophy on the windowsill, where the sunset cast a soft orange light over it. "I don't think it's about winning," he said thoughtfully. "I think it's about being heard." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "You were heard, sweetheart. Loud and clear." In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects began. The video of his final debate went viral, shared by educators, speech coaches, and even mental health advocates. Articles were written about the quiet boy who beat the odds, and interviews started pouring in. Noah remained humble, never chasing the attention, but accepting it as a tool to change the narrative, to speak up for others like him who had been misunderstood or dismissed. Our local school, once dismissive of his potential, now held assemblies in his honor. Former classmates who once ignored him sent messages of apology or admiration. But Noah didn't dwell on any of that. He wasn't looking for validation. He had already found it the moment he stood at that podium and chose to speak from truth. One moment that especially stood out came a month later, when we visited his old middle school. A teacher invited him to speak to a group of 7th graders. Kids just like the ones who used to giggle and whisper behind his back. Noah stepped up in front of them, not as a lecture, but as someone reaching back. "I used to think being quiet made me invisible," he told them. "But it's not your volume that gives you value. It's your voice. Even if it only comes out in pieces, it matters." And in the stillness that followed, I saw something miraculous. A row of shy kids in the back, heads always down, eyes always turned away, slowly look up. That, to me, was the real victory. In the days that followed Noah's victory, our lives subtly but steadily began to shift. It wasn't like some grand door opened and fame flooded in. It was more like the slow burn of dawn after a long night. The transformation came not with fireworks, but with dignity. Noah went back to school with the same backpack slung over his shoulder and the same quiet walk down the hallway. But now those halls held a different kind of silence, one of respect. Teachers who once overlooked him began pausing to ask how he was doing. Students who never spared him a glance now nodded in greeting or offered quiet compliments. It wasn't that they suddenly understood him, but they now recognized that beneath the surface, there had always been something remarkable. At home, his confidence began to bloom in quiet, beautiful ways. He no longer hesitated before speaking during dinner, and when he shared his thoughts, they carried a certain weight, like he knew they were worth hearing. He began helping his younger sister with her essays, offering advice not with condescension, but with a rare gentleness that made her trust him even more. They spent long afternoons at the kitchen table, and sometimes I'd catch her looking at him in a new light, not just as a brother, but as a mentor. What surprised me most, though, was how Noah used his newfound platform. He didn't bask in the attention. Instead, he directed it toward others who'd been silenced. He started an online blog where he shared stories from kids around the country. Introverts, neurodivergent teens, or those simply pushed to the margins. He titled it Louder in Silence, and within weeks, it had thousands of readers. Noah would stay up late responding to messages from kids saying things like, "I thought I was the only one," or "You made me feel seen." I'd find him some mornings asleep at his desk, a notebook open, his pen still in hand. His story even reached the attention of national education forums. He was invited to speak at a virtual roundtable with other young leaders. Watching him address a panel of professionals with the same quiet confidence he had shown at the debate felt surreal. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about standing in his truth. And the world was finally listening. Meanwhile, our family was growing in ways I didn't expect. My own understanding of Noah deepened. I realized how often I had tried to pull him into the light by force, thinking it was the only way he'd be seen. But now I understood. Some lights shine best when you stop trying to direct them. They find their own path. I apologized to him one evening, not for protecting him, but for not always trusting him to protect himself. He smiled softly and said, "It's okay, Mom. You were always trying to help me fly. You just didn't know my wings looked different. The school administration, perhaps motivated by public attention, or maybe just shame, invited Noah to lead a new student mentoring program. It was designed for students who struggled with self-expression. Noah agreed, but with one condition, that it not be a program of fixing, but of understanding. He didn't want to teach kids how to be louder. He wanted to teach others how to listen better. That, to him, was real inclusion. I remember sitting at one of the first sessions he led. A group of quiet, hesitant students sat in a circle, fidgeting, unsure of why they were there. Noah introduced himself and simply said, "We're not here to talk louder, we're here to talk real. However that sounds for you." That opened something. Slowly, stories spilled out, tentatively at first, then with emotion, then with relief. One boy, a stutterer who'd never spoken in class, shared how ashamed he felt about his speech. Noah looked at him and said, "The way you speak is yours. You don't owe anyone perfection. Just honesty." The boy cried. So did I. People sometimes assume redemption has to come with a grand stage and dramatic payoff. But in reality, it's found in smaller, quieter spaces, in whispered truths, in quiet connections, in the stillness between words. Noah was building something lasting, not just for himself, but for every kid who ever sat in the back of the room and wondered if they mattered. That winter, as snow blanketed our front yard and the glow of holiday lights lit up the street, Noah received a handwritten letter. It was from Chase, the boy who had once tried to publicly humiliate him. It wasn't a plea for friendship, nor a sudden confession. It was an acknowledgement. Chase wrote, "I wanted to beat you. I thought debate was about dominance. But you showed me something else, that strength can be quiet, and truth doesn't have to shout. I was wrong. And I respect you now in a way I didn't before." Noah folded the letter carefully and placed it in his drawer, not out of vanity, but because it represented something important. The power of changing someone's mind without breaking their spirit. We had dinner that night with quiet joy, the warmth of the house reflecting the warmth in our lives. Noah didn't say much, but he didn't need to. His presence, once overlooked, now felt like the steady heartbeat of our home. And I knew without doubt that he would carry this strength into whatever future awaited him. He had learned how to speak, not louder, but with meaning. And in doing so, he had taught the world how to listen. A few months after the debate, our world had settled into a new rhythm, one where Noah's voice, once barely heard, had become a quiet force people respected. He still wasn't loud, and he never sought attention. But wherever he went, school, community forums, or even family gatherings, his presence carried weight. It wasn't the kind that demanded the room's eyes. It was the kind that changed people simply by showing them another way to be strong. The mentoring program he had started was now a fully fledged initiative, officially supported by the school board and expanded to neighboring schools. Noah insisted on calling it the quiet room, not as a place of silence, but of safety. Students who had once been cast as misfits or invisible now had a space where they were encouraged to express themselves without fear. Teachers began taking notes, realizing that listening was just as critical as instructing. And the real shift came when a few of those same students entered local speech competitions, not to win trophies, but to show the world that quiet kids had something to say. One chilly Friday afternoon, I found myself driving Noah to a school an hour away, where he'd been invited as a guest speaker to address students and staff on the value of quiet leadership. As I watched him walk toward the auditorium doors, wearing the same second-hand coat he always wore and carrying nothing but a folder under his arm, I felt a lump rise in my throat. I thought of how far he had come, not in miles, but in courage. Not in loud declarations, but in his steady, unshakable rise. I sat in the back of the room and listened to him speak, his voice calm and measured. Every eye was on him, every student leaned forward, not because he shouted, but because he meant every word. "Being quiet doesn't mean being weak," he said. "And being different doesn't mean being broken." I didn't need to change who I was to be heard. I needed the world to stop talking long enough to listen. The applause was long and genuine, not thunderous, but filled with something deeper, understanding. That night, over dinner, Noah told me he had been offered a scholarship, not just for debate, but for leadership through inclusion. A small liberal arts college that had followed his story through the blog and press coverage reached out, praising not just his victory but his mission. He hadn't even thought about college yet, too preoccupied with school and his quiet revolution. But when he read the letter aloud at the table, something sparkled in his eyes. For the first time, he saw the future not as something to survive, but something he could shape. Around this time, the local newspaper published a feature on Noah. The article was titled, "The Boy Who Spoke Without Raising His Voice," and it detailed his journey from a bullied outsider to a national debate champion and advocate for quiet youth. When we stopped by the grocery store later that week, strangers came up to us, offering kind words, shaking Noah's hand. He took it all in stride, never once letting it swell his ego. He still looked people in the eye with a softness that made them feel seen. He still helped his sister with her school projects, still made time to write replies to kids who messaged his blog late at night. Fame had not changed him. It had simply given him a bigger platform for the same quiet truth he'd always carried. One evening, I walked past his room and saw him sitting on the floor, surrounded by handwritten letters, hundreds of them. Some came from kids thanking him for showing them it was okay to be quiet. Others came from parents who said their children finally felt represented. I asked if it ever overwhelmed him. He smiled faintly and said, "Sometimes. But mostly, it reminds me why I started speaking." He wasn't just a debate champion anymore. He had become a mirror for all the kids who felt like they didn't belong. He showed them not just how to find their voice, but how to honor it, however soft or slow it came. As for me, I had changed too. I used to worry that Noah wouldn't make it in the world, that his quietness would be a burden, that life would chew him up for not being bold enough. But now I saw what real boldness looked like. Not in yelling, not in pushing, but in the courage to stay soft in a world that rewards noise. I had learned to stop filling the silence with my own fears and to trust in the power of his calm, steady rhythm. The greatest moment came not during any award ceremony or news article. It came late one night, after the house had quieted, and I found Noah on the porch, sipping cocoa and staring at the stars. I sat beside him, and he leaned his head gently against my shoulder. "I used to wish I was someone else," he said softly. "Now I just wish kids like me knew they don't have to be." And in that moment, I realized the resolution wasn't just in him becoming someone new. It was in him finally becoming exactly who he was always meant to be. When I reflect on everything my son endured and ultimately overcame, I don't just think of his triumph. I think of what it revealed about the world we live in and the quiet truths we so often ignore. Noah's journey wasn't just about winning a debate. It was about redefining what strength looks like, about reclaiming space in a world that measures value by volume. From the beginning, he was never broken. He was simply unheard. And that distinction, I've come to realize, makes all the difference. We live in a society that celebrates extroversion as the gold standard. Children are encouraged to speak up, perform, entertain, and assert. Classrooms often reward the fastest answers, the loudest voices, and the most charismatic presence. But what happens to the kids like Noah, the ones who observe deeply, feel profoundly, and speak only when their words are weighed and necessary? Too often, they're misunderstood. Labeled as shy, awkward, withdrawn. People think something must be fixed. But Noah didn't need fixing. He needed space. He needed patience. He needed time. Noah's story taught me that being quiet isn't the opposite of being strong. It's a different kind of strength, one forged in introspection, resilience, and depth. He taught me that leadership doesn't always wear a loud voice. Sometimes it walks with quiet purpose, changing hearts one listening ear at a time. His journey showed me that those who speak less often have the most to say, and when we finally give them the room, they can lead revolutions with whispers instead of shouts. But the moral here goes even deeper. It's not just about defending quiet kids. It's about rethinking what we value altogether. So much of our culture glorifies speed, volume, and domination. In classrooms, boardrooms, and social circles, we're told to compete, outperform, and overpower. But what if we measured strength not by how many people we silence, but by how many we invite in? What if the true mark of leadership wasn't how confidently we speak, but how carefully we listen? Noah's impact spread beyond a single stage or school district. His blog, Louder in Silence, became a safe harbor for kids around the world. Kids who had spent years being told they were too quiet, too sensitive, too slow to speak. For them, Noah became a symbol of possibility, proof that their voice, however soft, was still powerful. And in every email he wrote back, every late-night reply typed by lamplight, he poured hope into those who once felt invisible. I watched as kids who had never spoken up before started writing, sharing, even debating. Some didn't become public speakers, and that was never the point. They simply stopped apologizing for who they were. And that shift, internal, uncelebrated, and deeply personal, was where the real transformation happened. The world didn't just need to hear from Noah, it needed to learn how to make space for all the Noahs still hiding in plain sight. As a mother, my own journey mirrored his in unexpected ways. I had to unlearn the fear that my child would be overlooked. I had to let go of the urge to speak on his behalf, to protect him from silence by filling it with noise. In doing so, I discovered that love isn't always found in doing. It's found in trusting. Trusting that our children know themselves better than we do. Trusting that their timing, their rhythm, their way of being in the world has a purpose we might not yet understand. I remember one afternoon, Noah and I sat in the garden, the sun dipping low and bees buzzing softly around us. I asked him if he ever wished he had spoken up sooner, fought back earlier against the bullying, pushed harder for recognition. He shook his head. "I think everything happened exactly when it needed to," he said. "If I had been louder back then, I might have never learned how to listen the way I do now." That moment, like so many others, held a truth that echoed far beyond us. Growth doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it arrives like dawn, quiet, gradual, but transformative. And sometimes the best things in life take root in silence. The moral of this story isn't that every quiet child will win a trophy or receive national attention. The moral is that every child, regardless of their volume, deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. We need to stop treating silence like a deficit. We need to start recognizing it as a different language of wisdom, one that requires us to slow down, pay attention, and open ourselves to a fuller picture of human experience. If there's one lesson I hope other parents, teachers, and even students take from Noah's journey, it's this: never mistake quiet for weakness. Never assume that someone who speaks less feels less, knows less, or matters less. Often, they're the ones carrying the deepest thoughts, the richest empathy, the sharpest insights. We just have to listen. And to every child out there who has ever been shamed for being different, quiet, or slow to speak, please know this: you are not broken. Your voice matters. You don't need to become someone else to be worthy. The world may not always understand you, but that doesn't mean you're wrong. Keep being you. Keep thinking, observing, and holding your truth close until you're ready to share it. And when you do, trust that someone, somewhere, is ready to listen. Because if my son's story has taught me anything, it's that the quiet ones change the world not by overpowering others, but by inviting us into a deeper, more thoughtful way of being. They shamed my son for being quiet. And he showed them what real power sounds like.